The survey shuttle hit the atmosphere of Veth 4 at the wrong angle. Lieutenant Kate Mercer knew it the moment the nose dipped 3 degrees past the safety threshold and the stabilizers screamed. She had flown rough entries before, over dead rocks and gas giant moons, and one particularly miserable ice shelf on the far edge of the Kepler belt. She knew what a bad entry felt like. This was worse than bad. This was a coffin dropping. "Pull up, pull up, pull up!" she said, not shouting, just saying it the way you say something when you already know it will not help. The shuttle did not pull up. It came down through the green cloud layer of Veth 4 like a stone through water, spinning slow on its left axis, the hull screaming against the friction of re-entry. Kate had her harness locked and her helmet sealed, and her hands on the manual override that was giving her absolutely nothing. The jungle below came up fast through the forward viewport. Dark green, impossibly thick, a solid wall of alien growth that went on in every direction as far as she could see. She had time to think one clear thought before impact. She thought, whoever did this to us is still up there watching. Then the trees hit. The shuttle carved through the canopy for almost 200 meters before it stopped, buried nose first in the soft, dark soil of the jungle floor. The impact was tremendous and awful, and then it was over, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure on the ears. Smoke drifted through a crack in the hull. Somewhere deep in the wreck, something electrical popped and went quiet. Kate was alive. She did not waste time being grateful for this. She unclipped her harness, checked her limbs one by one with the fast, practiced habit of someone trained to assess damage before she felt it, and then moved through the wreck toward the crew compartment. She already knew what she would find. She had known before she even woke from the impact days. 6 of her crew were dead. The crash had taken 3 of them, and whatever had forced them out of orbit had taken the other 3 before the entry even started. Ryan Cole, the youngest member of the team, had been in the rear observation bay when the first hit came and simply was not there anymore. Kate stood in the wreck for exactly 30 seconds looking at the people she had worked alongside for 2 years, and then she moved on. Because the jungle does not wait for grief, and neither did whoever was in orbit above her. She took inventory. The emergency locker had survived. Inside it, she found a combat knife in a belt sheath, a standard-issue 10-round sidearm with a full magazine, a water filtration tube, a Mylar survival blanket, and a damaged navigation tablet that flickered when she turned it on but held a signal. She took all of it. She checked the pistol, counted the rounds by feel, and holstered it. 10 rounds, 1 knife, a busted tablet, and a blanket. She strapped the knife to her thigh and stepped out through the cracked hull door into the jungle. The air hit her first. Veth 4's atmosphere was breathable. She knew this from the pre-mission survey data, but it was heavy, dense with moisture and something that smelled faintly like copper and wet bark. The light came down through the canopy in long, slanted columns, greenish and dim. The jungle was loud. Things were calling to each other in the middle distance, high tonal sounds layered over a deep rhythmic pulse from something much larger and much farther away. Kate stood at the edge of the crash site and looked up. Through a gap in the canopy torn by the shuttle's descent, she could see a narrow strip of sky. The sky of Veth 4 was pale gold in the upper atmosphere and dark green at the horizon. And there, just visible, catching the light of the system's sun like a slow, drifting star, was the hull of a ship in low orbit. It was not her ship. Her ship was debris. She looked at the orbiting vessel for a long moment, memorizing its shape. Long and angular, asymmetric in the way things designed by non-human minds often were, with a wide belly and a cluster of sensor arrays along the dorsal ridge that were pointed, even at this distance, clearly downward. They were watching. She had been right. She thought about what that meant while she oriented herself by the tablet's damaged compass function. She thought about the entry failure, about the precise angle of the hit that had brought the shuttle down. That kind of hit was not an accident and was not a simple weapons strike. It was calculated. It was the kind of thing you did when you wanted something to survive the impact, when you wanted it to land, not burn. They had put her down here on purpose. Kate was a xenobiologist by training, which meant she spent her professional life observing the behavior of species that were not human and drawing conclusions from what she saw. The conclusion she drew now was clean and straightforward and not particularly comforting. She was not a survivor of an attack. She was something that had been placed in an environment and was now being observed. She filed that information away. She checked the jungle in every direction with the slow, careful look of someone who does not panic under pressure. Then she oriented herself northeast, toward lower ground where water would collect, and she began walking. Behind her, on the orbiting vessel, a broad viewport filled with alien faces watching the feed from the surface drones below. Several of them were laughing. None of them were worried. They had no reason to be, yet. The first night on Veth 4 nearly killed her, and it had nothing to do with the predators. It was the cold. Nobody in the pre-mission survey data had flagged how fast the temperature dropped after the gold light faded from the upper atmosphere. When the sun went down behind the curve of the moon, it went down hard and fast, and the jungle went from warm and wet to something close to freezing in less than 2 hours. Kate had the mylar blanket and she used it, curled into the hollow base of a massive tree whose roots rose out of the ground like the walls of a small room. She did not sleep. She sat with the knife in her hand and her back against the bark, and she listened to the jungle rearrange itself in the dark. There were things moving out there, big things. She could hear them by the way the ground responded, a faint, low vibration that came up through the soil and the roots and into her spine. Whatever they were not coming toward her, but they were not far either. She stayed still and she stayed quiet, and she counted her breaths to keep her mind from doing what minds do in the dark when they are alone and very far from home. By the time gray light came back through the canopy, she had a plan. It was not a complex plan. It was built on the same foundation she used for every field assignment in her career. Observation before action, information before movement, patience before anything else. She had been dropped into an alien jungle with minimal supplies by a species that thought she was helpless. The single most valuable thing she could do was prove them right for as long as possible while she learned everything about the ground they had dropped her on. She spent the first full day not moving far from the crash site. She sat at the edge of the wreckage for 2 hours in the early morning and watched the insect life, which on Veth 4 was not exactly insects but served the same function. Small, fast creatures that moved in patterns, and patterns meant information. She watched where the largest concentrations went when the temperature rose and the dew burned off the broad leaves overhead. They went northeast, toward lower ground, which confirmed what the damaged tablet had suggested about the watershed geography of this region. Water was northeast. She had already been moving in the right direction. She also found food, or something close enough to food that her body could process it. The bioluminescent fungi that grew in clusters along the northern faces of the largest trees came in 3 color varieties on Veth 4. 2 of them were toxic. She knew this not from any database, because the databases on the shuttle were now buried and crashed, but from the behavior of the small ground animals that moved through the undergrowth. They ate the pale gold variety freely. They avoided the blue and the deep orange ones completely. Kate tested a small piece of the pale gold variety against the inside of her wrist first, waited an hour, saw no reaction, and then ate a cautious amount. It tasted like nothing. It kept her moving. By midday on the second day, she had followed the insect patterns to a narrow stream running over dark, flat stones. The water was rust-colored from mineral content, but the filtration tube handled it cleanly. She drank and refilled and noted the stream's direction. Streams on any world with consistent gravity always told you where the land was going. This one ran roughly south, which meant she was on a slope and high ground was behind her. She filed that away too. Up on the Vorkai vessel in low orbit, the mood in the observation deck had shifted in a way that was small but noticeable. It was not alarm. Not yet. It was more like the feeling you get when a game is going on slightly longer than expected. and you begin paying more attention without quite admitting to yourself that you are paying more attention. The hunt captain, Geth Var, had not moved from his chair at the primary viewport for most of the past day. He watched the drone feeds with the particular stillness of a predator that has spotted something it has not categorized yet. The human was not running. Every prey species the Vorkai had ever dropped on a hunt moon ran. It was the first and most constant behavior. The immediate flight response, the burning of energy and panic, the movement that was fast and loud and directionless, and that always, eventually, led the prey into something worse than what was behind it. The Vorkai had built their entire hunting culture around this response. They had songs about it. They had ceremonies that mimicked it. The flight of prey was, to them, a fundamental truth of the universe. The human was not running. She was sitting by a stream eating fungus and watching the water. Veth Kar, the youngest scout on the crew, leaned toward the feed and narrowed his eyes. He said quietly that her movement pattern over the past 2 days looked like she was building a map in her head. Geth Var told him he was projecting intelligence onto a prey animal and that he should increase his wager on her survival time because he was going to lose it by morning. Veth Kar said nothing more, but he did not look away from the feed. On the jungle floor, Kate spent the afternoon of the second day doing something that would have confirmed every worry the young scout had if the drones had been close enough to see clearly. She was crouching near one of the surface drones, a flat, dark disc mounted low on a tree trunk, its sensor eye pointed outward, and studying it without touching it. She had found 4 of them so far. She was learning their spacing. She was learning their angles. She was working out with the quiet, methodical focus of someone who had spent a career learning how non-human minds solved problems, exactly what the coverage pattern looked like from above. By the end of the 3rd day, she had a rough picture of where she was being watched from and where the blind spots were. She sat by her small camp that evening, back against a root, and looked up through the canopy at the pale gold sky. She thought about the drone spacing. She thought about the angles. She thought about the blind spots. Then she thought about what you could do with a blind spot if you were patient enough and nobody above you thought you were smart enough to use one. She ate the rest of her fungus and went to sleep before the cold came down. For the first time since the crash, she slept well. Kate spent the morning of the 4th day studying the Wrath. She had first seen it 2 days earlier, moving through the trees about 300 meters east of the stream. It was enormous. 6 limbs, the front 2 doubling as arms when it reared up, the body low and wide and covered in something between scales and heavy hide that caught the light like wet stone. It moved with a slowness that was not clumsiness. It was the slowness of something that had never needed to hurry because nothing had ever made it hurry. The Vorkai drones tracked away from it automatically whenever it came near. She had noticed that on the 2nd day and filed it away. Now she understood what it meant. Even the hunters up in orbit were giving this thing space. She watched it from a distance all morning without moving closer. She watched how it turned its head when it heard certain sounds. She watched the direction it always moved when the temperature peaked at midday, northeast, deeper into the thick growth where the canopy was lowest and the air stayed coolest. She watched where it slept, which was in a shallow depression in the ground near a cluster of the large root-walled trees, half hidden under a shelf of hanging growth. She watched it the way she had watched hundreds of species across a dozen survey missions, patiently, quietly, and with the specific kind of attention that treated every behavior as a piece of information rather than just something interesting to see. By afternoon, she had a working model of its daily pattern in her head. She moved on. The 4 Vorkai scouts on the surface were not difficult to locate once she understood the drone coverage map she had been building. They moved between fixed positions, checking the relay beacons on a rotation that she had timed over 2 days by watching the small shifts in drone angle that happened each time someone interacted with a relay manually. 3 of them stayed within a cluster of positions roughly 2 kilometers north of the crash site. The 4th, who seemed to be the most senior, ranged wider and came south twice a day on a patrol route that passed within 400 meters of her current camp. She moved her camp that afternoon, deeper into the blind spot network she had mapped, and set it up with the same care she had used on the first night. Low, hidden, with clear sight lines in every direction and two separate exit routes through the root systems of the large trees. Then she waited for the patrol scout to come south. He came at dusk, as he had on both previous days, moving through the undergrowth with the confidence of something that had never been hunted and could not quite conceive of being hunted. He was large, like all the Vorkai she had seen on the drone feeds before the crash. Nearly 2.5 meters, bipedal, with the long, backward-jointed legs of a dedicated ground predator, and a broad chest that suggested the kind of lung capacity that made long pursuit possible. He carried a long-range pulse rifle across his back and a short blade at his hip, and a communicator on his left forearm that glowed faintly blue in the low light. He was not looking down. That was the thing Kate had noticed about the Vorkai in every piece of footage and every behavioral report she had ever read. They were ambush specialists from above and ahead. They looked up into the canopy and forward into the undergrowth. They did not look down at the ground because in their entire evolutionary history, nothing that mattered had ever come from below. Kate came from below. She had spent the afternoon moving a thin length of vine between two root structures at ankle height across the scout's patrol route, strung just tight enough to catch a leg moving at walking pace. She was not there when he hit it. She was already behind him, having moved through the blind spot in the drone coverage that she had spent 3 days identifying, and when he went forward and down, she was on him before he had processed what had happened. It was fast, and it was quiet, and she felt nothing about it except a cold, practical relief when it was done. She took his communicator. She took the short blade, which was better balanced than her combat knife and nearly twice as long. She took the ration pack from his belt, which contained compressed blocks of something she could not identify, but that the biological scanner function on the damaged tablet confirmed was not toxic to her chemistry. She took the stun baton from his secondary holster, a flat-handled device that discharged on contact and that she tested once against a root to confirm the charge level. She left everything else. She moved 2 kilometers west before she stopped and sat with the communicator and spent the better part of an hour working through its translation function. The communicator was not designed for humans, and the interface was built around touch points sized for Vorkai hands. But the underlying translation database was extensive. It had been built to communicate with multiple species, which meant it contained a working language index that covered basic Vorkai vocabulary and sentence structure. Kate was not going to become fluent. She was not trying to. She was looking for specific things: patrol communications, position reports, command frequencies, and the particular kind of language that told you how a military unit was organized and who was giving orders to whom. She found all of it within the first hour. She also found the betting pool. It was a running thread on the crew communication channel, updated regularly, with names and wager amounts attached to predicted survival times for the human on the surface. The current favorite had her dead by the following morning. The longest prediction gave her 4 more days, and that prediction had been entered by someone listed only as V-Car, and had been openly mocked by several others on the thread. Kate read through the whole thread twice. Then she did something she had not done since before the crash. She smiled. She put the communicator in her pocket, picked up the stun baton, and went back into the trees to find the second scout. Up on the vessel, Geth Var was standing at the viewport when the patrol scout's signal went dark. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he pulled up the surface drone feeds one by one and scanned them carefully. Nothing. No movement, no signal, just jungle. He told himself the scout had simply moved into a dead zone. He told himself the equipment had malfunctioned. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation that had nothing to do with the small human female who was somewhere in the undergrowth below. He almost believed it. Then the second scout's signal went dark, and Geth Var stopped telling himself anything at all. Geth Var did not sleep that night. He sat in the command chair of his vessel with the surface drone feeds arranged across every screen in front of him, and he watched them the way he had not watched anything in a very long time, with the focused and uncomfortable attention of something that is no longer entirely sure It is the most dangerous presence in the room. 2 scouts were gone. No bodies on the feeds. No signs of struggle on any of the cameras. They had simply stopped transmitting, one after the other, 4 hours apart, as if the jungle had quietly swallowed them whole. He pulled up the footage from the nearest drones to each last known position and went through it frame by frame. On the 3rd pass of the 2nd scout's feed, he found it. A single frame, partially obscured by hanging growth, showing a shape low to the ground and moving in a direction that was not away from the scout's last position but toward it. The shape was small. It was human-sized. It was moving with a patience and a deliberateness that made something old and instinctive in the back of Gethvar's mind go very quiet. He closed that feed and did not watch it again. Instead, he woke his remaining surface scouts, all 4 of them, on the command channel and told them in flat and simple terms that the prey animal had become a complication and that they were to find it and eliminate it before first light. He told them to move in pairs. He told them not to move alone under any circumstances. He did not tell them about the footage. He did not tell them what the shape in the single obscured frame had looked like, moving low and quiet through the jungle toward something twice its size that never saw it coming. On the jungle floor, Kate was already moving. She had heard the command channel burst through the stolen communicator before she had even settled into her camp for the night. Her Vorkai vocabulary was limited and rough, but the meaning was clear enough. They were sending 4 down to find her, moving in pairs, with orders to finish it. She had perhaps 2 hours before they were on the ground and oriented. She spent those 2 hours doing something none of them would have predicted. She went to find the Wrath. The massive creature was in its sleeping depression when she located it, the broad body rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths, the 6 limbs folded close in the way she had observed it resting during the heat of the day. She did not go close. She sat at the edge of its territory, just within the perimeter she had mapped over 4 days of watching, and she waited. She needed it awake, and she needed it moving, but she did not need it aware of her specifically. She needed it simply present and alert, which on a creature this size meant the same thing as dangerous to everything in the surrounding area. She took a flat stone from the ground and threw it high and hard into the canopy above the sleeping depression. It landed with a crash of disturbed branches. The Wrath came awake like a small earthquake. It rose from the depression in a single motion that should not have been possible for something that large. All 6 limbs spread, its head swinging in wide arcs as it scanned the tree line. It made a sound that Kate felt more in her chest than heard with her ears, a deep, resonant pulse that the jungle answered with immediate silence. Every calling creature within 500 meters went quiet at once. Kate was already gone, moving northeast along the stream bed, using the stones to avoid leaving ground impressions, staying low. The first pair of Vorkai scouts came down 2 kilometers north of the crash site and moved south in a standard search pattern, communicating in short bursts on a frequency Kate was now monitoring continuously. She let them move for an hour. She let them get comfortable with the jungle, with the silence, with the absence of any obvious threat. She let them start to feel like hunters again instead of whatever they had been feeling since the command channel woke them in the middle of the night. Then she led them to the Wrath. It was not complicated. She moved ahead of them, just visible, just audible, just enough to keep them following without triggering a full sprint pursuit. She moved them northeast, along the route she had already walked twice that day, into the lower ground where the canopy was thickest and the air was still and heavy, and the Wrath had returned to its territory after the stone had sent it ranging. She heard the moment they found it. The whole jungle heard it. She was 400 meters away by then, already doubling back south toward the second pair. The second pair was more cautious. They had heard the sounds from the north, and they had stopped moving and gone back to back in a small clearing, which was sensible and professional, and would have been the right call against almost any threat the Vorkai had encountered before. Kate studied them from the undergrowth for 20 minutes. She noted that the one on the left checked his long-range rifle every few minutes with the nervous habit of someone who wanted to be using it and could not find a target. The one on the right was scanning the canopy, which told her he was thinking about ambush from above. Neither of them was looking at the ground. She used the stun baton on the left one first, coming in fast and low from the blind side of a root cluster. He went down hard and loud, and the right one spun and brought the rifle up and found nothing. She was already behind the root, already still, already part of the shadow. He called out on the communicator. His voice was not steady. She waited. She let the silence do its work. She let him stand in the clearing with a downed partner and no target, and the sounds from the north still faintly audible and the jungle pressing in from every direction. Then she took him with the knife, non-lethal and precise, targeting the joint in the lower leg armor where the Vorkai anatomy was weakest, a detail she had found in the communicator's biological index at 3 in the morning 2 days ago while the jungle was cold and dark around her. He went down. He was alive, and he would stay alive. She left him there in the clearing, visible, conscious, and unable to move independently. She pulled out the communicator. She opened the command channel. She composed the message in careful, broken Vorkai, checking each word against the translation index twice before she sent it. 4 words, simple and direct. I am not done. She clicked send and put the communicator back in her pocket and walked north into the dark jungle without looking back. On the vessel, every screen on the command deck showed the message simultaneously, broadcast on the primary crew frequency so that every single member of the hunting party saw it at the same moment. Nobody spoke for a long time. Geth Var read the message 4 times. His hands, resting on the arms of the command chair, were very still. Behind him, he could feel his crew watching him, waiting for him to say something that would put the world back in the correct order, that would explain what was happening on the surface below in terms that made sense, that would restore the version of reality in which a lone prey animal with a knife and a pistol was not a serious concern. He thought about the shape in the single obscured frame of drone footage, moving low and quiet toward something it should have run from. He pulled up the human database instead. It was thin, almost nothing in it. A few trader contact reports, 1 intercepted communication from something called a military debrief, a set of biological survey notes from a long-range probe that had passed through human space 18 months ago. He started reading. By the time the first gray light touched the upper atmosphere of Veth 4, Geth Var had read everything in the database twice and was sitting in silence with an expression his crew had never seen on his face before. Veth Kar, watching from the back of the command deck, recognized it anyway. He had seen it on prey species. He had seen it on animals the moment before they understood what was coming. It was the specific and terrible look of something realizing too late that it had made a very serious mistake. Veth Kar found her just after midnight. He had come down alone without telling Geth Var, without logging the descent on the crew manifest. He had taken a single-seat drop pod and come down in the dark on the far side of the crash site and walked 2 kilometers through the jungle using nothing but a hand light and the surface drone map he had memorized before he left the vessel. He was young by Vorkai standards, barely past his first hunt cycle, and he was not entirely sure what he was going to do when he found her. He only knew that whatever was happening on this moon was something he needed to see with his own eyes, and not through a drone feed from orbit. He found her camped by the smell of the small fire. She had not hidden it. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground with her back against a wide root, the fire between her and the tree line, the stolen communicator open on her knee. She had the stun baton on the ground within reach, and the long Vorkai blade on her other side, and the pistol holstered at her hip. She looked tired in the way that things look tired after they have been working very hard for a long time, but her eyes when she looked up at him were completely clear. She did not reach for any of the weapons. He raised his pulse rifle. His hands were steady, but his breathing was not. She looked at the rifle and then looked at his face and then looked back at the fire. She said in broken Vorkai that was much better than it had been 4 days ago, "You have a choice your captain does not know he gave you." Veth Kar did not lower the rifle, but he did not fire either. He said slowly that she should explain what that meant. So she did. She told him first what she was, and she was careful to be accurate about it because accuracy was the whole point. She was not a soldier, not in the specialized sense. She was a scientist who had received the same basic combat training that every human in deep survey work received as a matter of routine, because deep survey work took people far from support, and the universe was large and sometimes unfriendly. The training was not exceptional. It was standard. It was the kind of thing humans considered the minimum reasonable preparation for leaving their home system. She told him there were roughly 12 billion humans. She told him they occupied a volume of space that was still expanding. She told him they had been building faster-than-light-capable vessels for 60 years, and that the designs improved consistently every 18 months. She told him about the wars, not the small ones, the large ones. She told him about a conflict that had lasted 11 years against a species the humans called the Keth Rule, a species that was larger than the Vorkai, faster in open space, and significantly better armed at the start of the war than the humans were. She told him how that war had ended. She told him that the ending was not something humanity was proud of particularly, that it was documented in administrative language in military reports and discussed in universities as a case study in what happens when a species pushes humans past a specific point and does not finish the job in the first engagement. She told him all of this in the same flat and quiet tone she used for everything, sitting by the fire in a jungle on a moon she had been dropped on with a knife and 10 rounds as a joke. Veth Karr lowered the rifle. Not all the way, but enough. He asked her how she had known he would come down. She said she had not known for certain, but she had watched his wager on the crew communication channel, and she had read the way he watched the drone feeds, and she had concluded that he was the kind of person who needed to understand things rather than simply win them. She said that kind of person was useful. She said that kind of person occasionally changed the direction of very large and very bad situations by making a different choice than everyone around them. She moved the stun baton aside and gestured at the ground on the other side of the fire. He could shoot her, she said, and go back to Geth Var and be part of whatever came next. Or he could sit down. Veth Karr stood in the dark at the edge of the firelight for a long moment. The jungle was loud around them, the night creatures calling back and forth through the canopy, the distant pulse of something large moving in the eastern growth. The fire was small and warm, and the human sitting beside it looked entirely like someone who had already decided how this ended and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He sat down. They did not talk much after that. Kate fed small sticks into the fire, and Veth Karr sat with his rifle across his knees, and they listened to the jungle together in the particular silence of two people from entirely different worlds who have run out of the specific kind of words that start conflicts and have not yet found the kind that build anything else. After a while, Kate tilted her head back and looked up through the gap in the canopy at the pale stars. She said quietly and without drama that her rescue beacon had been transmitting for 4 days, that her people had a response protocol for missing survey crews that was considered standard procedure, that the response protocol involved a minimum of 12 vessels, and that they would be close by now. Veth Karr looked up at the stars, too. On the command deck of the hunting vessel, Geth Var had finally finished reading every piece of human documentation in the database. He had read the Keth Rule debrief 3 times. He had sat with the final paragraph of that document for a long time, the one that described the conclusion of the 11-year war in 2 sentences of administrative language, so dry and matter-of-fact that the scale of what it was describing did not hit you until the 3rd or 4th reading. He was on his 5th reading when the long-range sensors went loud. 17 vessels, dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, not in combat formation, spread in the wide, loose pattern of a search grid, the kind of pattern you used when you were looking for something specific in a large area and wanted to cover the ground efficiently. His tactical officer pulled up the vessel classifications and put them on the main screen. Search and rescue configuration, all 17 of them, unarmed by Vorkai standards, though the tactical officer noted after a moment that the classification was based on hull profile only, and that internal loadout was not confirmed. Geth Var stared at the screen. 17 search and rescue ships, sent for 1 missing survey crew, as standard procedure. He thought about the administrative language in the Keth Rule debrief. He thought about what a species looked like when it sent 17 vessels after a single missing scientist as a matter of routine. He thought about what that same species looked like when it was not doing routine things. He gave the order to withdraw before the human vessels had completed their entry into the inner system. He gave it quietly, and he gave it without explanation, and nobody on the crew argued with him, because every one of them had been watching the same feeds for the past 4 days, and every one of them had read the message on the command channel, and not one of them wanted to be in orbit above this moon when those 17 ships finished their search grid and found what was on the surface. The hunting vessel turned and accelerated toward the outer system and did not look back. On the jungle floor, Kate saw the vessel's running lights move across the gap in the canopy, slow at first and then faster, heading away from the moon and not returning. She watched it go without any particular expression. Then she looked back down at the fire. Veth Kar watched her face while she watched the lights leave. He asked her after a moment in the careful, halting, translated speech of the communicator if all humans were like her. She thought about it. She thought about the survey crew she had lost, about Ryan Cole in the rear observation bay, about 6 people she had known for 2 years. She thought about the Keth Rule debrief and the 11-year war and the administrative language that described the end of it. She thought about 12 billion people going about their lives on 100 worlds and what the average among them looked like, and what the edges looked like, and where she fell on that particular scale. She said, "Most of the ones I know, give or take." Veth Kar nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected but had needed to hear out loud. The rescue ships came down at dawn, their landing lights cutting long, bright lines through the gold and green atmosphere of Veth 4, settling into the clearings north of the crash site with the practiced efficiency of crews that had done this many times before. Kate stood at the edge of the tree line and watched them land with the stun baton on her belt and the knife at her thigh and 6 rounds still in the pistol she had not needed to finish using. Beside her, Veth Kar stood and watched too. When the first rescue crew came through the trees and saw her, the team leader, a broad-shouldered woman named Lou Garrett, stopped and looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at the Vorkai standing next to her, and then looked back at her. Lou said, "You doing okay?" Kate said, "I have had better weeks." Lou looked at Veth Kar again. She asked, carefully, what exactly she was looking at. Kate said he was the first Vorkai to make a different choice. She said that probably meant something and that someone back home with more diplomatic authority than a xenobiologist should figure out what. Lou stood in the early morning light of an alien jungle on a moon that smelled like copper and wet bark and looked at the two of them standing together at the tree line, a human woman with a knife and an empty expression, and a very large alien who had apparently decided to sit by a fire instead of pull a trigger. She said, "All right then." And that was how it ended. Not with a battle or a speech or anything that would look significant from the outside, just a tired woman walking out of a jungle and a young alien walking beside her into the dawn light, and 17 ships waiting, and a very long debrief ahead. And somewhere in the outer system, a hunting vessel running hard for home with a hunt captain who would spend the rest of his life hoping nobody asked him what had happened on Veth 4.